So for most of us, when we first started out this whole filmmaking journey, we didn't really know what settings to shoot in. And back then, most of the cameras didn't really have a log profile. They had a movie setting, they had a still setting, they had a neutral, which a lot of people tried to reconfigure and try to make it as flat as possible and try to hack the system to make it like log. But for most of us, we just shot in the standard movie profile, trying to get a Rec 709 look straight out of camera. And it was super complicated. There was so many different opinions on the different settings you could use. And fast forward to now, Sony has thrown that out the window. They made their own profile that has a very filmic look of Rec 709, and they made it so simple and so easy to get a great looking image straight out of camera. And this profile is called S-Cinetone. So what is S-Cinetone? S-Cinetone is basically Sony's version of cinematic Rec 709. It basically takes the Rec 709 color space, but tweaks it a bit to make it match the cinematic tones of the Sony Venice. Thankfully, Sony added this to a lot of their newer cameras. I believe it's the A1, Sony FX3, FX9, the FX3, the A7S III, of course the Venice, and the A7 IV might have it. On the Sony FX3, you could find S-Cinetone and PP11, and the base ISOs are 100 and 2000. Compared to standard Rec 709, it definitely feels more filmic and more like a professional cinema camera. In terms of dynamic range, you're going to be sacrificing some stops. S-Log3 gives you 14 stops of dynamic range, and S-Cinetone gives you 11, and you can definitely see this when comparing the footage side by side. But on top of that, you're getting the advantage of not having to spend any time color grading, and you're getting a beautiful image straight out of camera. So with S-Cinetone, I highly recommend just exposing what looks good to you. So as I was editing this video, I realized that S-Cinetone is really a lot like the old Cine 4 on the old Sony cameras. A lot of us grew up shooting on Cine 4 because S-Log2 is so tough to work with, and Cine 4 was kind of a profile that a lot of people try to hack and change all the settings to make it like the best profile, but S-Cinetone really just throws that all out the window, and it makes it so easy to get a really good looking image. But that doesn't mean S-Cinetone is the best profile on the Sony cameras. I believe that best profile is S-Log3 with S-Gamut 3 Cine. So what is S-Log3? S-Log3 is Sony's main log profile. It gives you the most dynamic range and gives you just a really flat neutral image to craft your look from. S-Log3 has a base ISO of 640 and 12,800, so you're definitely going to need ND filters with S-Log3. A lot of people claim that S-Cinetone saves a ton of time on color grading because S-Log3 is so hard to color grade. I don't really agree with that. S-Log3 is a really easy log profile to work with. You throw on a Rec 709 LUT, as long as it's exposed properly, you're gonna get a great looking image no matter what. And I think for a lot of people, having the flexibility and dynamic range of S-Log3 is gonna be more worth it than saving time on color grading with S-Cinetone. So those are the two main profiles that I recommend shooting on these new Sony cameras. You have your standard Rec 709 profile with S-Cinetone, then you have your standard flattest high dynamic range log, which is S-Log3. So this last week, I've been testing out S-Cinetone to see if it's really viable in a workflow for someone like me. So my first impressions of S-Cinetone, it's pretty solid. For being a standard profile that requires no color grading, it looks way better than any other standard 709 profile I've seen straight out of camera, and it definitely has a more filmic tone to it. I noticed that with the base ISO of 100, I was never really using heavy ND when I was out filming. I definitely noticed that the footage looked a bit sharper than S-Log3. I recommend dumbing down the detail a bit. Just go into the profile, go into the PP setting, go down to detail, bring it down to -7 because it's at -5 standard. But for being a standard 709 profile, I was pretty impressed by it. There was a couple scenes that the image just didn't really have enough detail to have a nice roll off, but that was only in a few settings where it was a high dynamic scene. But for most settings, the footage looks pretty good. The S-Cinetone profile also looked a lot like iPhone footage, and iPhone footage is pretty common now. I see a lot of brands using it for ads or stories or whatever because it's intimate. We all have phones, so that iPhone HDR phone-like quality is kind of like sought after for certain brands. So I can definitely see people using S-Cinetone to mimic mobile phone footage for certain shoots. When comparing S-Log3 to S-Cinetone side by side, I definitely see the quality difference. S-Log3 just has so much more data in it. It's a softer look. It looks more filmic. When you see them side by side, S-Cinetone doesn't really look that good in comparison, but when standalone, S-Cinetone looks pretty solid. So when would you use S-Cinetone? I could see value in S-Cinetone for a couple things. One, if you're working with a client and you just want to hand off the footage and they're not going to color grade it or they don't really know how to do things like that, shoot an S-Cinetone, make sure it's good, hand it off to them, it'll be a breeze. I can see value in doing live streams or Twitch or anything like with a webcam base. I've heard of live streams getting funky when you're working with logs, so having a standard profile that looks really good straight out of camera, where no one really cares about dynamic range, I think that's a pretty good option too. And for beginners who are still learning the exposure triangle, I just recommend using S-Cinetone. It's super easy. Log gets a little confusing when it comes to overexposing and base ISOs and stuff. Just shoot an S-Cinetone, put it at ISO 100, just learn how to use your camera and learn to tell a story. I think S-Cinetone definitely lends itself better towards that kind of crowd, definitely the beginners and the people who are doing live streams. I can't ever see myself using S-Cinetone again. It's decent, but I want to have the best quality possible, so SLOG3 is definitely my choice for the Sony FX3. And if you have a quick turnaround and you're shooting an SLOG3, just slap on a LUT, do a couple contrast and exposure adjustments, and call it good. It's basically the same thing, but it looks cleaner, and the highlight roll-off is definitely a lot smoother. So do I recommend S-Cinetone? Kind of. Like I said, it really depends on who you are. Definitely for beginners, I recommend it. For working professionals or YouTubers or people who want the highest quality possible, just use SLOG3, learn how to expose it, pick your favorite LUT, and color grading doesn't really take that long. If it ends up taking a long time, just throw in some music, have fun with it. But I'm really stoked on S-Cinetone. It just shows that companies are starting to innovate. Instead of having a boring old standard profile, we're getting these profiles that mimic the more expensive cameras that are shooting all these feature films. And I think S-Cinetone's a great place to start at for a lot of people, but for someone like me, I just want to shoot in log. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions on S-Cinetone versus S-Log3. So yeah, take it easy guys. See you next week. Peace.